The Los Angeles night was as thick as asphalt as Bill stood by the window looking down at the receding light of the freeway, the indifferent ring of the phone breaking the already thin silence, and the text message hidden under the monotone voice of the prison doctor poured down like a block of ice. Luna died in her cell after a fight. The first report noted post-traumatic cardiac arrest. And the hallway camera at that exact moment had suddenly gone into maintenance mode. Every detail melted into a black sludge of doubt and anger, and Steffi, who had been dragged through too many legal and violent maelstrom, wanted to end it all, to put a clean end to a rotting chapter that would keep the family's fragile margin of safety clean, while Will, the youngest but also the one who had suffered most from Luna's shadow, burned with a cold determination to see the body, to put his eyes on the truth, to compare the bruises with the words himself, because no report could save a heart that hadn't faced its own final confirmation. The dawn at the city morgue opened with the cold smell of antiseptic and the flickering fluorescent lights, where every story was flattened into labeled toe tags, and every memory was folded into a white cloth pulled over the forehead. Bill walked between the metal cabinets, as if through an archive of guilt and atonement, reading and memorizing each line of the death certificate like a locksmith groping for the key to an invisible door. The time of death determined after an 11-minute fight, the cause cardiac arrest due to trauma, the note about the injuries concentrated in the chest and neck, the additional note about a previously undiagnosed conduction disorder, while Will silently scanned each code number, checking it against the list of prisoners being transferred overnight, his gaze stopping at a thick line of ink. Transfer order signed 6 hours before the time of death, and the signer was recorded with a fast-running signature that trailed like a whiplash. At that moment, all the questions arose like a flock of birds caught in the spotlight. Who signed? Why signed early? Where to transfer? And to whom, if the supposedly dead person was still a moving name on a living document? Steffi, caught between the black and white of what she had to do and what her heart was silently begging for, chose to withdraw from the eye of the storm by setting up safe boundaries, ending all legal complications, ending all protests, ending sleepless nights, chasing a figure fading into nothingness. Steffi's hands had once lifted an entire family through fire, but now they trembled slightly when they touched the icy tabletop of the lawyer's conference room, where people talked about ending the procedure, minimizing risks, minimizing media exposure, and her heart broke into a cold sweat every time an old photo flashed in her mind, showing a half-real, half-fake Luna with eyes like a newly sharpened blade. Steffi's desire to close the coffin lid isn't just for safety, it's an unconscious method of preventing memories from growing poisonous mushrooms, because if the hunt for truth returns, everything she protects will be poisoned again. Will pulled Bill out of the morgue's pathology corridor with pieces of data sharper than any dissecting blade. The server log showed the hallway camera maintenance for exactly 1 hour, perfectly matching the gap in the time tape from the alarm to the medical team. Recording no pulse. The access log marked a technician's name tag as having been on leave for 2 weeks, 10 minutes with the case open, 10 minutes with no log, 10 minutes with it closed as if never touched. The shipping manifest listed a refrigerated truck leaving the annex morgue just before dawn for stock coordination, the driver claiming a detour onto a side road long used only for garbage trucks, and the words, "Transfer order," signed 6 hours before were like a rivet piercing all the layers of cover, turning the system into hollow armor. Bill, with his experience of smelling dirty money at 20 paces, sensed that the ink was from a hand not accustomed to signing in front of a camera, but in the dark, a man who knew which door opened with which key, a man who knew that to hide a man alive, he had to first grant him a legal death on paper. The rain was as thin as needles on the city streets as Bill and Will returned to the prison. The warden's office closed with a hired smile and words as flexible as freshly laid asphalt, but next to the door was a warm photocopier, a paper tray still stuck with a draft of a transfer order that had not yet been thrown away. Will leaned on his arm, feeling as if he could hear Luna's heart pounding from the ground as his eyes fell on the crooked prison seal, the hand-edited date frame, and the strange signature running diagonally across. Everything around Will suddenly shrank, narrowing into a pinhole, beyond which lay a dark hallway where shadows passed without a sound. Will's mind was filled with hundreds of possible motives, from seasoned wardens to envelope-taking medical personnel, from middleman lawyers to a courier, but they all merged into one nameless shape: the network. Steffi was at home, the high windows of the mansion pouring a warm white light into the living room, the family photos on the wall suddenly becoming small windows into moments she wanted to erase. She counted missed calls, rescheduled meetings, crossed out hearings, sent out documents canceling explanations, tried to clean her life of a name that was dying and resurfacing in the media, unaware that across the city, an old signature was pushing against a secret door as heavy as concrete. Steffi's fatigue was wrapped in armor of determination. Her fear was hidden in the drawers of calculation, and every time she turned off the lights, she saw in the darkness a slender figure smiling with unsmiling eyes. Bill opened the death certificate again, thanking once more his habit of not believing anything until the numbers bit by themselves. The side notes were streaked with red lines. The time the toe tag was pasted was 3 minutes off from when the server registered the cold room door. The on-call doctor's signature looked as if it had been hastily written with a drying pen, and on the appendix page, a suggested transfer of ashes at the request of the family had been prepared without a cremation request. Will stood next to him, his eyes fixed on the toe tag, which had the word Luna written in a slant he had seen on Luna's old notes when she wrote her own excuses. He didn't know if he was looking for a death or a rebirth, only that the truth was never on the surface, and every surface was polished to reflect the beholder. As dawn broke over the hills, Bill pulled Will to the shipping depot, where coolers were stacked and route tags hung like tired talismans. A tag reading "Warehouse Dispatch" was attached to the refrigerated truck that left at 4:20 a.m. The route branched off to a satellite morgue 12 miles south, a 15-minute stop, a shift change at a gas station without cameras. The string of stops was like a string of beads falling just right, not too much, not too little, so perfect that only a practiced hand and a heart that could not tremble would dare draw it. Bill asked for an inspection. The warehouse manager shrugged. The barcode scanner popped up a blank space like a tax return, and the list on the side read "Sensitive goods. Do not open without supervisor present." The supervisor's absence became someone else's heavy presence, and the silence around the four walls became rubbery. Steffi was on one side of the city, Will on the other, Bill in the middle, a bridge pulled in two directions at once, one by the logic of the neat end, the other by the intuition of a tracer. In Bill's mind, the faces lined up: the on-call doctor with the empty pen, the primetime camera maintenance technician, the driver with a roundabout route, the warehouse worker with a friendly scanner, a quick signature on a transfer order, and behind it all the shadow of someone with enough authority to make a system blink. Bill's calls bounced off the walls like rain against corrugated iron, while Will quietly opened each log file, took screenshots, patched the gaps with memory and feeling. They both slowly realized that this story wasn't about a dead body, but about the power of a network to create and distribute a dead story. In the afternoon, Bill returned to the annex morgue, where a drawer bearing Luna's name had been pulled out just as he arrived. The coverlet bounced back a little more flat than rest. The drawer was empty. The clerk on duty fumbled through the ledger, the fresh lines still smelling of wet ink, transferred by order of the supervisor. Appeared 10 minutes ago, the recipient's name covered in a thick layer of ink, as if it had been pressed over and over again. Will stood rooted to the spot, the cold air from the metal drawer seeping through his shirt. He saw at the bottom of the drawer a drop of salt water that hadn't dried yet, a small but sparkling mark, like the sly greeting of someone just retreating from the stage. Night fell, the city glowing with millions of light bulbs trying to push back a sticky darkness that clung to every pane of glass. Steffi sat at her desk, the file closed, the signature dry. Every line drawn straight, like whiplash on water. But inside her, a new silence was growing, no longer the silence of denial, but the silence of the instinct that had saved her from countless storms, the feeling that what had just been buried was not an end, but a movement, a slip, a switch of hands. On the other side, Bill ordered a backup of the control room server tape. Will sent another time series, and they both knew that tomorrow morning, another door would have to be opened. not by a key, but by the lever of a restless question. Down in the basement of the morgue, the auxiliary generator started and shut in cycles, each rumble causing the strip of ceiling light to jerk slightly, making the shadows of the metal drawers breathe. Bill stood still amid those false breaths, his hand touching a faded file, his finger sliding across a corner page that had once been folded, and stopped on a detail smaller than a letter, a rescribble on the curve of the transfer order signature, a habitual rescribble of someone who always hid his tremor by pressing hard on the pen. The rescribble flew off the signature frame by an inch, leaving a scratch like a claw mark on the glass. And so everything, from the traumatic cardiac arrest record to the maintenance camera, from the refrigerated truck route to the empty drawer, from the outsourced smile of the warden's office to the perfect fatigue of the system, converged into a single bright spot like the head of a rivet. The signature had been placed 6 hours before the death was declared. Who had signed it? Who had the power to create a legal death in exchange for a disappearance? Who decided that the truth would be shoved into an empty drawer and pulled back with a cold hand? In the long corridor of the morgue, a light bulb flickered and went out, leaving the end of the hallway in a thick darkness, and at the edge of the darkness, Bill thought he saw a streak of black ink running from an invisible sheet of paper, spreading up the toe of his shoe, soaking into the tile, and then disappearing as if it had never been there. The question hung in the cold air, sharp as a razor blade. If death could be signed before it happened, whose pen touched the paper, a corrupt official, a system keyholder, or a hand so familiar everyone ignored it because it was too close?
Who signed?
The fog was like a shroud that had fallen over the city when the family signed a request for an independent autopsy, a seemingly dry procedure, but the last thread holding the edge of the truth, and right at the moment the red seal was stamped, the morgue announced with a sentence so cold and emotionless: the body bag named Luna had been wrongly delivered and disappeared. A piece of information as slippery as oil but leaving a prickly feeling in the brain, because everything below the layer of procedure began to smell of manipulation. The tiled hallway reflected the fluorescent lights into silver ribbons. Worley stood stiff as a statue, the doctor's shoulders used to holding the scalpel suddenly heavy as if carrying stones when he heard the word mistake, and Poppy sapped everyone's patience with the burning heat of a mother's heart, spelling out each word of resentment in the air. Two women with family scars tearing at each other with silent arguments and accusations. The argument rumbling like waves crashing against the wharf, while Steffi stood diagonally at the door, her eyes fixed on the cold, shiny floor, where a long, opaque line appeared from a low angle, a straight line pointing to the side door that was always locked, a hard, sliding mark of the stretcher touching the dried-up floor, the antiseptic spread in a leaf-shaped streak, a faint phosphorescent color that only those who had been in the operating room enough would recognize as a rare preparation. Used in the surgical unit, not the everyday spray of the morgue. The silence that followed the announcement was shattered by the presence of precedent. The town had once murmured about Luna dead and alive again, a rumor that reeked of a cheap script that everyone dismissed until the darkness again opened its hands to cover it up, and this time every detail suddenly fit together like a sawtooth. The camera, maintenance, on time. The transfer order 6 hours in advance. The body bag wrongly delivered. The stretcher changed routes. The operating room disinfectant suddenly appearing where it should never have. All like an old playbook upgraded with greater cruelty, smoother, less holes. Except for that long slide, like a hair lying diagonally across the mirror that even the best makeup artist could not pretend not to see. Lee braced himself for control, skimming through each form, running his hand over the barcodes that had been scanned countless times until the edges were worn, pulling out the file drawers to find the ink stains, trying to reorganize the world with the lines of procedure but stumbling upon a flexible vacuum. The file drawer had all the signatures but still lacked a body. The list had all the stamps but lacked a face, while Poppy threw all logic to the floor, stood straight in front of the glass and waited for some shadow to confess. Because when a mother loses her child's name to the morgue's mathematics, every bang on the table turns into a wordless distress signal. Steffi walked down the hallway as if in a familiar dream, a dream of the days when she had carried her entire family through the sea of fire, where everything smelled of two things: the smell of legal papers and the smell of truth that was never entirely contained in paper, and the instinct of the survivor told her a small noise running in the bowels of the house. If the goal was to extinguish a name, one would not risk leaving the whole road, but there was the trail and the smell of rare medicine, the mark of a hasty bend to wipe a spot, and the faint imprint of a glove on the handrail. It didn't look like an accident. It looked like a scheduled, coordinated transfer, a hand that knew the map of the building like the back of its hand. The memory of Luna dead and alive again, rushed in like the smell of old seawater. No longer the joke of anonymous comments, but the point of a knife re-scraping a bruise that hadn't healed yet, and confusion followed like a swarm of mosquitoes when the glass door opened. But in the midst of that fog, a question popped into Steffi's head as sharp as a needle. If someone wanted to take Luna out, which way would they choose? The paper way or the cold way? The paper way was laid out, the transfer order signed in advance. The cold way was clear: the gurney, the side door, the freezer, and when the two paths overlapped, the sum of them always amounted to a legal death plus a clean disappearance. A formula that attempted to rob the living of the only possession they retained: the right to know. Lee turned back to the metal table, shining the light down the track. The antiseptic ingredients reverberated in his memory like a memorized list of a doctor who had spent more time in the operating room. Analide and quaternary bases were rarely seen outside the operating room because they left an unpleasant film on the stainless steel surface, used only when quick and clean was needed. In the morgue, people used chlorine-based, which was more volatile to avoid sticking. And yet here, the smell of quaternary wafted up like an unintentional confession of someone in a hurry. Poppy looked through the side door opened by a silver chain. Behind the storage compartment was a dark area that smelled of burning electricity, where the floor was still dotted with tiny white grains like salt, the kind of salt people used to sprinkle to absorb moisture in cold boxes. The wrong handover book was left loosely on the shelf. The corners of the paper curled evenly, as if it had just been smoothed with a ruler. The printed words "wrong handover," corrected, were thicker than the rest, like a pre-printed sentence used to silence all questions. Steffi saw the structure of the old script clearly. First a prison cell tragedy, then a valid death report, then a camera shutdown, then a pre-death transfer order, and finally a mishandling. A hatch covering the pit. But this time the scriptwriters seemed unaware that the smoothness of the hand turned everything so perfect into something suspicious. The room became cramped as the four walls pressed back against each person's chest. Lou was caught between her professional oath and the shame of the piece of paper. Poppy was caught between the cry of blood and the roar of the system. Steffi was caught between her predatory instinct and the ghost of decisions that had bitten her back, and the name Luna, though absent, swelled in the air like a black balloon pumped from under the floor. Outside, the medical waste truck rolled by, leaving a wet trail that shimmered in the thin sunlight, and the feeling that just under this placid steel lay a tunnel of identities packaged in the word procedure made every breath a notch heavier. The doorman held the list like a paper shield, each of his empty answers like a cotton ball soaked in anesthetic thrown into the minds of those who were asking, tiring the knees, discouraging the legs, weighing down the eyelids. But the glaze on the floor remained there, refusing to disappear, cutting into the eyes like a mishandled stitch on a surgical wound. Old rumors flutter back into the streets, piercing the ears of those who don't want to believe them. Luna is dead and alive again, but when someone who was once the target of the whole system still comes to the surface with a timely breath, the town learns to be more attentive to nonsense, and panic becomes a glowing underwater creature, pulling people away from the shore. Steffi stands up straight, the needle of doubt embedded in the ribbon of intuition, putting the pieces back.